basically, this is, the United Nations had the Security Council get together, decide, they went to all of their member countries, what's the most important factor you're facing? Climate change. This is on conservation, on ecology. We have got an amazing panel who I'm going to ask to come up now. I'd like Paul, Leena, and Patrick to come and join me, and we're going to try and find out a way that we can save our planet. Thank you. I'm going to start. I'm going to get my guests here to introduce themselves, so a little bit about what they do, and then you'll understand why we've got such a good panel. So, Paul, I'm going to start with you, if I could.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for the attendance today. I wish we could get more people through here because I do believe this is the most important. And I'm going to urge the organizers to push conservation higher up on the agenda so that we can get a big crowd like we saw yesterday. I think it's bloody important. And anyway, so I'm the CEO of Mantis Collection. We're a hotel group based out of South Africa, homegrown. And our partners in our business today are Accor. They acquired 50% of us. And so we look forward to a great expansion plan into Africa, and in particular, Ethiopia.
Fabulous. Leena?
Hi, everyone. I'm Leena Gehlot. I'm the director of Future Hotels. We own 2 unique luxury safari camps in Kenya. One is in partnership with Sir Richard Branson. It's called Mahali, Mzuri. It's in the Mara. We set up a conservancy, 13,500 hectares, and we contribute to 300 Maasai families through this conservancy. It's actually one of the prime wildlife conservancies in Kenya, and we've made a great impact in that area in terms of conservation and community. And the second one is called Finch Hattons. That's in Tsavo. It's the 2nd largest national park in Kenya. And we've been there for 25 years, also contributing to wildlife conservancy and community.
And then Patrick?
Hi, Patrick Fitzgibbon with Hilton. I feel a little bit like a fraud here because we don't run conservation establishments today, but I think that's actually one of the most important aspects to this because it's not just about what happens actually within the game parks. It's about what happens, I think, in wider society. We're 100 years old this year, and I think the next 100 years for us as a company is going to be about sustainable tourism and really making that work globally. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to think about how we make that work.
That is true. And okay, this is aimed at conservation, but actually it covers everything. So I thought we might start off. I mean, obviously, when we're building a hotel, that's got some issues, but actually we run hotels. How do you run a hotel ecologically? Whether it be in the game park, whether it be one of your properties all around the world, what sort of things should we be looking at, and how can we improve how we're running hotels? I'll start with you, Paul.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, I think, I mean, obviously if it's a game reserve, it's the conservation of the animals, the protection of the animals and the wildlife that come with that product, because without that, you don't have a successful, sustainable business, yeah. And engaging community, because it's not just about single-use plastics and everything else. In Africa, it's very much about engaging community, and because then if you're looking after that side of it, and they see the value in the wildlife, it's a win-win.
Yeah.
But what we've done as Mantis is we've just yesterday at AHIF we hosted a press conference, and we launched the first ever Eco Lodge Innovation Hub. And the purpose of that is, and this is at our little lodge down in South Africa next to Shamwari Game Reserve, is to innovate and come up with these ideas off the grid bedrooms. And we're building 5 separate units to almost get them off the grid. They're going to be totally different, each unit. And we're going to test technologies. There's a lot out there. There are a lot of green tech out there. We want to find best in class. We want people to come to the reserve and innovate with us. And so I can't tell you what that blueprint's going to be, but it's certainly going to come out of our innovation hub, and that's how seriously we're taking it, yeah.
Fabulous. Leena, have you got any tips for us on operations?
I think, there's obviously building with sustainable materials, thinking about your solar and your affluence, how it's going back into the conservancy that you're in. But ultimately, it's looking at it in long term. This is not a short-term thing. It's, if we're going to be there, are we able to remove what we've built and look like we haven't left any footprints behind.
No, that's always useful. Patrick, you've got a different take because you've got, well, thousands of properties
I mean,
all
I think
over.
that there's been a real focus for probably 20 years on trying to build buildings more efficiently, more economically, with better green credentials. And I think actually there's been huge strides. I think when that started initially, there's a real sense that that was very expensive and the owners would pay a huge premium for that. That's changed enormously. That's changed enormously for two reasons. One is that I think the research into some of the technology, some of the materials that are used today, some of the equipment that's used today has significantly brought down operating costs. But one of the other really big changes is the consumer behavior, particularly from a buying perspective. As many as 1 in 3 customers now using hotels globally have an interest in the environmental impact of that company. That's such a sea change. Yeah. 20 years ago, it was very industry driven. It was driven by a small number of people. My kids today will talk about the things they achieve and see in hotels. We went on holiday not that long ago. We weren't staying in one of our hotels, but it could have been. And my 9-year-old ran around the room looking for all the products, piled them on the bed and said, why do you put these in hotel rooms? You know, the plastics, single-use plastics, whether it was the shampoo bottle or that it was the laundry bag or the water bottle. And I think the big change we're seeing is that whole consumer, the younger consumers, I mean, you just see what with Greta Thunberg, you know, what she said yesterday in front of the UN. I think there's just such a sea change coming from consumers, and therefore for us it's something we as developers of hotels and builders of hotels, owners or operators of hotels cannot ignore. And we haven't been ignoring it, we've been doing it for 20 years. But there's a huge sea change from consumers who now don't just look for it, they're demanding it.
I've got to be honest, at Hotel Partners Africa, we did a lot of market research, ground level stuff, talking to consumers, talking to operators on the lodges market 5 years ago. At that time, we found there was a fair bit of greenwashing going on. So we'd talk a good game. I'd want to go somewhere that was actually ecologically sound, wouldn't necessarily spend any more money. We updated that work this year. We're actually finding that consumers are prepared to spend more money if they think it's actually making a difference. The level of money they're spending isn't necessarily enough, and I'd like to see them spend more, but is that something that you guys are finding? Are you finding that people are actually picking your properties based on the good works that you're doing and the fact that you're building the conservancies and making them work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the experience in itself is much more personal. It's the whole high impact, low volume tourism model. Yep. You know, so in the conservancy, the game life viewing is better, and you're getting people who want to come there and not to the reserve. People who actually understand. And you know, with the whole next generation calling it a climate emergency, as opposed to climate change now. Yep. I think people are a lot more aware.
No, I think
and
that's
choosing.
Yeah, listen,
yep,
I can't argue with that. Yeah, I think we are certainly noticing that. I mean, we're starting to make a lot more noise about what's going on all our platforms, and so much so that we've launched a foundation as part of our group called the CCFA, which is the Community Conservation Fund for Africa, and that was done jointly with Accor when we formed our JV over 18 months ago. And I think it's about storytelling, telling them what we're up to, because there is a lot that we're doing which doesn't get told, and I think we should start sharing that. But I think what that's going to result in is that audience is going to lean towards these types of products. Certainly that's the hope.
We're certainly finding that actually people are taking into account all of the things that you're doing, and if you can make more noise about it, it makes your competitors feel as though they've got to do it as well, which is really what we need to do. One of the areas that we've mentioned briefly is the people, employment. If you can get local people on board, it really does help you in your efforts of conservation in the game parks. I remember a story from one of your properties, Leena, that one of the GMs told me. Way back when we had one bad year in Kenya where there was some poaching that wasn't there. The only area that didn't have an uptake in poaching was your conservation, your conservancy, and it was because everybody could see that the good works that come in. Every lion basically generated another few bucks that went into the local community, and you could see the direct link from it, which is quite useful. We did some work with Tusk, who are big conservation campaigners when we climbed Kilimanjaro, And they were insistent that most of their money went into education. It was trying to change the mindset of people, which, you know, if we can get that right, we've got a chance. But what would you say are the biggest challenges to wildlife preservation in Africa at the moment? Is it just a lack of education? Is it perhaps cattle encroachment? Is it the ivory trade? Where would you see the problems are?
I mean, there's a broad answer to that. I think in South Africa, we've been particularly poor in engaging community. So, and I think that may be a legacy of apartheid. You know, we've built these great big game reserves. You don't necessarily have fences like you do in Kenya and Tanzania. Everything in South Africa is fenced off and protected. We're protecting the hell out of our rhino because they, I guess, are getting decimated. We're losing 3 rhino a day in South Africa to poaching. And I think now it's time to actually peer over that fence that we've erected and see what's on the other side and start embracing community far more. And that's why, again, we brought up, I think we ventured into this NGO space with the CCFA, is to try and engage. I mean, for instance, what we're doing is we're managing the lodge in the Akagera National Park in Rwanda, and just adjacent to that is a great big lake. Now, in the genocide, the fish were completely fished out. There was obviously a major shortage of food. And so what we're doing today as a CCFA is we're rehabilitating the lake, and we're putting a lot of fish back into that. And the intent there is certainly for the locals to have a supply of food, but then also to try and generate these little micro businesses that will supply our lodges with food. So that's just a really nice, simple example of how we're embracing community and setting up little businesses.
Leena, obviously you've been very successful, but...
Yeah, I think there's a misconception that poaching is the big problem.
Yep.
You know, a greater challenge is actually twofold. One is loss of wildlife habitat, and it's human-wildlife coexistence, as we like to call it, not conflict. And I think there's just a general lack of awareness of the importance of wildlife. You know, it's vital to the economy and to the people of Kenya. I'll use Kenya as an example. Wildlife is a major attraction. 9.5% employment. It goes into tourism. 10% of GDP is tourism. And these conservation areas are vital not only to the economy, but also to resources. Near our second camp, Finch, Hattons, is Mzuri Springs. It actually provides water for the second largest city in Kenya, Mombasa. And, you know, people just don't see the link, so they just think, oh, it's just a tourist thing. Yeah. So I think it's a big, we need to raise awareness through education, especially in the next generation.
Yeah. The most success, I've done quite a bit of work in Uganda, which is where I was from, with some of the operators there, and where they've been hugely successful is where they fully engage the local community, and they are completely embedded in everything that happens. And I think it's interesting that, you know, and it's great that everybody here has turned up here, but it's disappointing that any number of people who have come to this conference don't necessarily see conservation as such an important issue. If you look at Africa and look at people's bucket lists from a leisure travel perspective, you know, there is very few people in the world you won't go and talk to who won't talk about wanting to see animals in the wild on their top 5 or top 10. And yet we don't necessarily have as much focus on how you protect that long term. As an industry, I think there are some amazing pockets where it's done well, and it always has to be executed locally. We were talking about this last night. You can't, you know, governments are in shambolic enough state. You see what's happening in the UK at the moment as an example. But you cannot allow and sort of anticipate that governments will dictate what has to happen. It starts on the ground. And where it works on the ground, and there's a great relationship between the local community and the facilities, that there's often, you know, real sustainable success. The other thing we've seen, just away from conservation destinations, things like saving energy, and thinking about environmental footprint, the engagement we have with our employees across Hilton now is breathtaking, because they're driving it. It's not being driven by the CEO saying, we must save 40% of water or whatever. Yeah. It's actually, and once you engage your population, your team members, everybody around you, the success is incredible. And I think the big change we're seeing, particularly in the climate emergency, and I think it is a climate emergency, is it was scientists telling us, and now it's everyday people from across the planet saying they're really concerned. I think what we saw from David Attenborough's recent series on oceans and the rubbish being poured into oceans, I think has really woken people up. And we shouldn't be concerned about displaying those images because it's real and we have time to do something about it. And to me, the conservation piece is critical, but what's almost more critical is what we do away from those areas, which will ultimately impact what happens in the areas where we have, tremendous wildlife. So you can't do one without the other.
No, I think that's true. I mean, if we can turn around and stop using some of the fossil fuels, some of the plastics that we're doing, etc., we can make a difference. There are some operational challenges with that, though. I went to a lovely lodge down in Namibia, and it was completely green, all solar panels, or whatever. I couldn't pay because there was a cloud over the sun. There wasn't enough stave. I couldn't put a credit card through. You've got to look at these things practically to make sure it works, whether it be just an old-fashioned, zoomy thing that you can do. But it is something that we do need to look at as an entire, as the whole of the hospitality business. We've got to look at how we can change these things because it's just it is a climate emergency, I think you're right. Can we learn anything from Botswana? So, for example, Botswana has some of the greatest game reserves we know in the world. People come in there, they spend $4,000 a night to go and stay there. You have 4,000 people come into that one area throughout a whole year. It's not mass footprint. It's not there. And the majority of the country is not national parks. It's conservancies. So the Delta is just a whole bunch of different conservancies run properly. Is that something we can learn from across the continent? And if we can find a way of making the way that it works in Botswana work in other countries, perhaps that can be a way forward. I don't know.
Listen, I'm no expert in that field, but I mean, we can see the results of that quite clearly. Obviously, they've had the hunting issue that they've had to deal with in Botswana, and I think, when you delve into that topic, we can't go there as a hotel group. Nobody can because it's such a twitchy subject, and you can't really associate with it now. But they've reverted back to that, and that will be quite interesting to see what impact that has on the tourism. But they've got a great model. I think you're quite right. That conservancy model is brilliant. And, I look at our little patch of land in the Eastern Cape, and I think at the moment there's so many egos attached to those little blocks of land everybody owns.
Yep.
And if we could get them to tear down the fences, I promise you it would be far more impactful because we could create our own Kruger Park down in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. So I think we've got to change mindset. We've got to get rid of egos in this industry because in the conservation industry, they're big egos, believe me. But tearing down fences is beneficial to the game experience, which is obviously going to be beneficial to the pockets and the communities and everything else. So I agree with it, and I'd love to see it happen, certainly down in South Africa.
Is there anything you guys could learn in Kenya?
I mean, here's a conservancy that we've got that works. And when we first drove around it, I thought, gosh, this is just a farmland. How is it ever going to be a wildlife conservancy as much as we want to be partners with Richard Branson? And I was amazed how once you control the grazing, within 2 years, it was like magic.
Yep.
But I don't think you can really use a cookie cutter model. You've got to look at the local culture, the communities, what do they need? And it's really about expectations and a win-win for both sides for it to work. So yeah, I'm not too familiar with the Botswana model, but I do know this works in Kenya. And some conservancies work better than the others.
Yeah.
And I think that's when they can see the trickle-down effect and everyone's on the same page and there's benefits going to the community. In our conservancy, I think 70% of the employment in the lodges is from the community. So I think when there's a direct benefit and they can see that, it all works concurrently.
I think you also have to be really honest about the costs involved. So if you think about the mountain gorillas, both in Bwindi and also from across the mountain, the cost of seeing gorillas and tracking for gorillas now is not within everybody's reach. No. It just isn't. It's $800,000. But I think where that was 25 years ago was catastrophic. They really were facing a complete annihilation of a species, or a number of species. And they actually put a plan in place. There's things they could have done better, but on balance, it's been wildly successful. And they've managed it. and it was managed with the local community. The rangers are all local community rangers. So over time, that's going to be completely embraced by the local community. And I think there are aspects of that you need to think about in other game parks. In Uganda, they've rolled out a big rollout of an enterprise to promote the development of hotels in the parks. And I've said all the way along, that's fine, but they need to be incredibly sensitive and make sure the influence on that park is complementary and beneficial. Yep. You know, you can't build 300 or 400 bedroom lodges. It just doesn't work. It's just not sustainable. And I think that government have a role when they start those initiatives in making sure they're thoughtfully executed so that you don't create a problem. And they certainly are at the moment. That's the evidence that they are. But it is about doing it with the local communities. You cannot stress enough the importance of that. Where that doesn't happen, it just doesn't work, and there's huge conflict. Yep. Where the conflict, when organisations who run facilities have got rid of that conflict, it just works and it grows and it gets stronger, and the wildlife come back because they're managing the land better and they're able to grow it. That's what we all want to see long term, but it's not an easy fix. No. It just, you know, that's not our area of expertise at all, and we're not going to move into that area. What we're looking to do as a company is try and work with existing operators and think about opening those facilities up to a wider portfolio of guests, because that's the challenge we face, is we've got guests who want to stay in those kind of facilities, but we don't have them. And in a number of those facilities, they're struggling with low occupancies because they can't necessarily penetrate the markets globally that they want to penetrate. And in many of these facilities, it's year-round. It doesn't have to be 3 or 4 months a year. No. And I just had probably one of the best safaris I've ever had in the winter in South Africa, and a private game reserve just off Kruger. Why? Because the grass was down and you could just see abundant wildlife. Yeah. So, but that's a message not all tour operators understand. Most tour operators will say, oh, you have to go, you know, during the migration. That's one part of game viewing in Kenya. You don't have to. So there's a lot of education there in terms of how we think about that. No, there is.
But that actually brings us to another interesting point. I mean, if we just quickly look at the gorillas, you've seen that Rwanda's put the price up to 1,500. It used to be 500 in all the 3 countries you could see them. There hasn't been any comeback from the guests. Happily go along. I mean, some people might go to Uganda where it's only $600 now. But the thing is, you will happily pay that because it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Do you have to be at that sort of level to get the returns on investment for your clients? For you guys as owners, I mean, and for your clients, you know, your hotels, do you need to be able to generate those sort of rates from your hotel when you stay there to be able to get the returns you need? Or is it just something that you put your money into as a philanthropic venture? I mean, I know there are a few lodge companies that I know that basically the owner just puts in a couple of million, never sees it again, but it runs for the next 30 years quite successfully, covering its costs, and that's it. I mean, what do we have to do to make this something that people would invest in?
Listen, I think it's, you know, when you're pricing, you know, as I said earlier, there's such a big value to wildlife, and you take the wildlife out of Africa, it's the end game for the continent. You know, that's what people come here for, and you see that in Nigeria. There's zero tourism there. There's corporate business, but zero tourism. So I think when you look at the Rwanda model, that price is big now, but as you say, it hasn't impacted anything. No. I think what the shame there is, obviously there are the masses that don't get exposed to that experience, and that's important too, because you know that's where a lot of the messaging comes from. I mean,
you know, I think it's about the business model that you set up right in the beginning. If you look at the conservancy that we're in, we've got 5 tourism products, and actually they're at different rates, so it can work. And why would people come and invest in it? Well, here's examples of where it has worked really successfully and made a huge impact.
I think there's one comment, we were talking about this last night. When you go to a tour operator, and huge numbers of safaris are booked through tour operators today, they just are not direct, although some run very successful direct businesses, they'll say just go for 2 days, you just need 2 days. The reality is when you go into many of these locations, they're amazing destinations where actually 3 or 4 days, and some people will stay for 5 days because you don't have to go on a game drive every day. Mm-hmm. And it's not just about wildlife, it's about the culture, you know, what's happening just generally in those markets. And I think that's something, again, it's incumbent on us to help people think not just about going into the bush just to see wildlife, but to experience the culture. You know, some of the stargazing in Africa is the best in the world, and some lodges do it very well. They don't all. So it's about changing perception a little bit, and I think that will help change the model and make it more sustainable, because you should be able to run at high occupancies. It doesn't mean you put high occupancies into the bush on game drives every day. No. It's about making it more successful, and I think that's one of the things we'll bring to the party is to think about what is it people are looking for, and often people just want time, quiet, relaxation, you know, and that's something that actually people value enormously. But we don't always sell it, but actually there's a consumer looking for that.
That's true, very true.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, our piece of research that we did showed that your typical safari guest will come along for 6 to 7 days, and they'll visit 2 different parks in that time, 2 different game lodges, and they will probably do 2 things a day, whether it's a morning drive and an evening drive. They might try and find something else, and it's the variety of things that actually made the operators very successful. But it does mean that most operators need a circuit. Otherwise, they lose control, or they're giving it over to a third-party operator who's changing them from place to place. And I think the secret is, if you're going to run something like this, you need to have your own circuit so that you can actually control the whole guest experience, and you can actually, you know, make the most of them, but actually then spend the money looking after the place that you've got. We've got a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask if there's any questions in the audience.
I want to pick up on the question that David raised. Do you have to charge those kind of rates to get the returns? That was certainly one of the considerations, and it drew some high-end operators in there, like Wilderness Safari. But I think there's a different question, and that is what happened in the discussion at the recent conference in Kigali on the business of conservation. And it is what the Prime Minister of Ethiopia said when he looked at what Rwanda had done. And he said, we didn't realize that we had a premium content, and so we didn't charge appropriately. It was a form of protection, and that's what Rwanda did. They said, this way we're going to low volume, high yield, because we want to protect the gorillas, but also gave enough money to go back to the protection and to the community. So it's an interrelated issue. I wonder if some of you would comment on that.
I've got to be honest, that's my bugbear as well for Kenya. I love Kenya to pieces, and I don't think they price it properly. You do, Leena. But most places, they sit there, and they've got something that is absolutely stunning. Some of the best beaches, some of the best game safari ever. And then some of the places you go, you get a taxi driver showing you around. And that's not the way it should be. And honestly, if Kenya appreciated what they'd got, they'd be charging rates like Botswana and getting them. Sorry, anyway. That was just me jumping in.
It's, you know, I could probably go back to South Africa again, but we're quite different because we've got our fancy lodge on the hill, and we've got a great game experience at Shamwari Game Reserve, which we traverse along across. But then 20 minutes away is Addo Elephant National Park, and there you kind of get the locals, and it's far more affordable and everything else. So I think it's important to get the balance, because you've got to, if your locals aren't buying into it, and I'm not saying your disadvantaged communities, just the local populace of South Africa don't buy into wildlife. There's going to be no voice for them either. So you've got to get that balance right. But I think the lower footprint is certainly very important. We've seen it with Rwanda, as we've mentioned, and I think that is valid. I think there's got to be some kind of a balance.
Perfect. Have we got any other questions?
Just on that, I think one of the things you want to avoid is commoditization. Everybody has to think about what their unique proposition is, and I think there are many. I've been lucky enough to visit parks in sort of 6 or 7 different African countries, and they're all different, and they offer different things. And I think Botswana in particular has done an amazing job, particularly with bird life, you know, more than anywhere else, I think. And therefore, the uniqueness of what they're prepared to offer, they can price it accordingly. My sense is that if you don't do that, and you offer the same as everybody else in your particular area, it becomes price-driven. And if it becomes price-driven, one thing happens, it goes down. And that's the danger. So to me, you have to be proud of what you develop it well, and sell it, because there is undoubtedly a market there. Don't chase the market down on price, because then you can't afford to do the things that you know you need to do to sustain your site, the local economy, and everything else that will make it ultimately successful long-term. So that's really important, and therefore you have to work out what your unique proposition is and how you're going to deliver that.
I think there's a play from the local government as well, in terms of legislation that they put in to protect these conservation areas, what the tourism management plan is, and that also dictates what pricing people come in at. If they think it's too high risk, then, you know, the price goes up.
Fair enough, fair enough. Time for one last question, otherwise we'll pack up. I think we're done. Well, thank you guys. Thank you very, very much. It was
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
really interesting.